Welcome to a tour of St. Augustine, Florida. Ponce de Leon claimed Florida for Spain in 1513. Other Spanish explorers later found gold and silver in Mexico and Peru. The treasure was sent back to Spain in ships sailing in the Gulf Stream. Spanish settlements needed to be built in Florida to protect the Spanish treasure fleets. King Philip II of Spain sent Pedro Menendez to settle Florida and drive out French garrisons recently established there. In September 1565, Don Pedro Menendez de Avilés, with 700 soldiers and colonialists, landed here and founded St. Augustine, making it the oldest continually occupied European settlement in North America. Menendez successfully destroyed the French fort Caroline at the mouth of the St. John River, 40 miles north of St. Augustine, and ended the French incursion into Florida. St. Augustine settlers, isolated and often near starvation, lived in constant fear of attacks by pirates who roamed the coast and preyed upon Spanish commerce. Diminishing supplies and increasing hostilities of the Indians made life treacherous for the early settlers. Menendez has established other military outposts, but only St. Augustine survived. Englishman Francis Drake burned the village and wooden fort to the ground in 1586. St. Augustine was sacked again in 1668 by pirate John Davis. Spanish Queen Regent Mariana realized that St. Augustine was a keystone in the defense of the Florida coast, so she ordered the construction of the new fort made of stone. In 1672, the Castillo de San Marcos was begun, and it took 23 years to complete. Originally, the fort was covered with white plaster, some of which can still be seen today. The towers in the four corners were plastered red. The fort was built of coquina shell, a formerly quarried soft shell rock. Coquina was easily shaped by artisans and did not become brittle or crumble under cannon fire. The fort, the city gate, and many homes in St. Augustine were made of coquina, which is still evident today. The first stop on the tour is the Bridge of Lions. With its Mediterranean Revival towers, the bridge was built in 1926 to give cars access to Anastasia Island. The bridge is named for the two lion statues at the west end of the bridge, which were sculpted by Romanelli of Florence, Italy. They were donated by Dr. Andrew Anderson of St. Augustine. The next area you may notice is the city gates. At one time were the only entrances to the town, with a moat that ran from the Castillo westward to the San Sebastian River. The Cubo defense line, which was a wall on the southern side of the moat, protected the land approaches from the north. A drawbridge at this gate was raised each evening and not lowered until the following morning. St. George Street begins at the gate and continues south. The Castillo de San Marcos National Monument is one of St. Augustine's most impressive historical landmarks. Its construction by the Spanish started in 1672, making it the oldest masonry fortification in what is now the United States. The Castillo de San Marcos replaced 9 earlier wooden defenses which had rotted away. The stone used in the fort and in many of St. Augustine's colonial building is coquina. It was quarried across the bay in Anastasia Island. Coquina is quite soft and porous in its natural state, but quickly hardens when it is exposed to the air. The large blocks were floated across the bay by barge, then lifted into place by the Indians and slaves using hand-operated derricks. The Castillo withstood 2 sieges by the British, but were never captured by the enemy. Another stop we'll point to will be the Flagler College. It was formerly the Ponce de Leon Hotel. Built by Henry Flagler in 1888 and one of the finest examples of Spanish Renaissance architecture in America. In 1967, the hotel was turned into Flagler College, a 4-year coeducational liberal arts college. Another stop will be Flagler Museum. Opened in December 1888, the Alcazar was the second luxury hotel built by Henry Flagler in St. Augustine. It had steam rooms and massage parlor, still visible today, and an indoor swimming pool that was the largest in the world. The Alcazar closed in 1931. Today, it is home of the city's administrative offices and the Leitner Museum. The next point of interest might be the old jail. Built by Henry Flagler in 1891, placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1987. The old jail served as the county-wide jail until 1953. Guns, weapons, and courtyard displays were all part of this educational and a fun experience for the entire family. You'll certainly want to take a stop on St. George Street. St. George Street is the main entrance to the city on the northern boundary. It is best known street in St. Augustine because it runs south from the city gate. The city streets were laid out by Spanish decree by King Philip II in 1598. There are over 25 buildings on this street that have been restored or reconstructed. It is the location of St. Augustine's colonial experience, an 18th century living history museum. Another stop would certainly be the St. Augustine Lighthouse. This sturdy black and white striped lighthouse on Anastasia Island is one of the most impressive stations in Florida. The present tower, which was completed in 1874, is St. Augustine's first and oldest surviving brick structure. At the height of 165 feet, it houses a first-order Fresnel lens, which casts a light that can be seen up to 20 miles out to sea. Climbing the 219 steps of the tower will give you a breathtaking view of St. Augustine. The keeper's house has been restored to the year 1888. Another stop would be the Mission of de Nombre de Dios. Spanish explorer Pedro Menendez Avilés, with soldiers, priests, and colonists, landed here and founded St. Augustine, making it the oldest continually occupied European settlement in the continental North America. Father Francisco Lopez de Mendoza Dios offered the first Mass in America's first city in September 8, 1565. Nombre de Dios is America's first mission, and Our Lady of La Leche Shrine is the American oldest Marian shrine. Two other stops would be the Old Market. This site has had public markets on it since 1598. The market was built in 1824. The bell in the cupola would call villagers to the market when vegetables, meats, and fish were sold. The townspeople rebuilt the roof, which had been destroyed by fire in 1887. Also, the central location in St. Augustine is the Plaza de la Constitución. The plaza, which was first designed by the town plan drawn up in 1596 as the place for public gatherings and military drills. It is the oldest public meeting place in the continental U.S. In 1813, monument of the Spanish Constitution gave the plaza a formal name, adding in 1914 the gazebo continues to serve as a staging area for public concerts. Two other stops would certainly be the Basilica Cathedral. The church was begun in 1793 and was financed by the Spanish Royal Treasury. It was completed and dedicated in 1797 and became a cathedral in 1870. After a fire in 1887 destroyed everything except for the exterior walls, it was rebuilt and remodeled with a bell tower and transept. The Memorial Presbyterian Church. In 1889, Henry Flagler built this church as a memorial to his only daughter, Jenny Louise Benedict, who died at sea en route to St. Augustine. It is a beautiful example of Venetian Renaissance architecture and has a dome that is more than 100 feet in height. Henry Flagler and his daughter are buried in a mausoleum of the church. Another stop would certainly be the Fountain of Youth. Ponce de Leon came ashore to claim Florida for Spain in 1513. Visitors see evidence of the early Tamaulipan Indian inhabitants as well as existence of the 16th century Spaniards. Here you will find a navigator's celestial planetarium depicting astrological sailing techniques employed by Ponce de Leon. You can drink from the prehistoric Indian spring, and Ponce de Leon hoped was the fountain of youth. Another stop on the north end of St. George Street is the oldest wooden schoolhouse. This building was erected in the 18th century. The city gate sentries used this building as a guardhouse and shelter during the Seminole War from 1834 to 1841, since this was the closest unoccupied building to the city gate. The building was rented out in 1920 as a tea house and gift shop. Then in 1936 it opened as the same site as an historic exhibit building, restored as the 1864 schoolroom and teachers' living quarters. I hope you've enjoyed this informative tour of St. Augustine, and I hope you will learn to love it as much as I do. Thanks for partaking.